Hey everyone, welcome back to the Untrivial podcast. My name is Allie Nelson. I am back after a couple of weeks away. I had to take a little break there for a couple of weeks as I was wrapping up finals for my first semester of my master's. And just as that was going on, my little boy also hit the 4-month sleep regression. And if you don't know what that is, basically they stop being able to sleep essentially until you kind of help them through that. And for me, that has definitely been one of the most challenging parts of motherhood so far. We were really lucky that our son slept pretty well when he was in the newborn stage, but then at about 3.5 months, he started waking up like every 2 hours on the dot. It was super hard. I was so sleep deprived. And so, we're through the worst of it now and still kind of figuring out our rhythm. But now my semester is over and I am just so excited to get into the holiday spirit and enjoy some time at Christmas with my family while my husband's off work and really lean into our first Christmas with our baby. As it's the holiday season and we're all kind of looking for a bit of a rest and restore, this will be the last guest episode that I have for 2024. I will be doing one more solo episode before we move into the new year. It's actually really crazy because this month, December, marks 1 year since I started recording for this podcast. I launched in April of this year, 2024. Took some time off when my son was born in July, and now looking into 2025, I'm really just so energized and excited to start the new year and bring on more and more guests. I'm also building out a bit of a home studio for this podcast, which I cannot wait for. So you'll see that in the next few months as well. But really looking back on this year, it has been such a privilege to have so many incredible guests. We've talked about everything from boundaries to somatic movement, spirituality, marriage and divorce, fertility, entrepreneurship, and more. And there is just so much more to come. I would love to hear from you all in regards to what types of guests or conversations you are interested in listening to as we move into 2025. So please send me a DM what you'd want to hear about or who you'd love to hear on the show. You can DM me at Untrivial Podcast on Instagram. So we are wrapping the guest episodes of 2024 with someone who I am so inspired by. My guest today is Neha Ruch. Neha is the founder of Mother Untitled, the leading platform for ambitious women leaning into family life. A thought leader, influencer, and speaker who focuses on women, work, parenting, and identity, Neha aims to reframe and shift how society views stay-at-home motherhood and how they view taking a pause on paid work to focus on family. Her book, The Power Pause, How to Plan a Career Break After Kids and Come Back Stronger Than Ever, is set to launch January 14th, 2025. It is available for pre-order now, and I've included the Amazon pre-order link in the show notes, as well as her socials and website for you guys to check out. As someone who is currently on maternity leave, I have found so much value in this conversation. I think so many women who choose to have children need to hear insights like Neha's to help us feel empowered with our choices, no matter what they are. And so I do really hope you all enjoy this episode. Neha is a change maker, and I personally cannot wait to read her book, but I hope that this conversation can act as a little bit of a window into what her perspective is all about. And I really hope you enjoy. And with that, let's get into the episode. Neha Ruch, welcome to the Untrivial podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm so good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I am so excited to have you here today and talk with you all about motherhood and Mother Untitled. But before we get into that, I would love if you could share with us a little bit about your background and career before Mother Untitled. Like, what brought you here?
Sure. So I started my work journey in marketing. I was lucky enough to join a social media boutique agency in 2006 when the internet was when Twitter was still nascent. And I was assigned, ironically, to the mom blog beat. That was my job, was being in charge of, connecting with all of the mom influencers. So it's really interesting. It feels very full circle. A lot has changed and some of it has stayed exactly the same. But anyways, I got my footing at that agency and ended up doing really well in the area of digital strategy. And I ended up in my later 20s saying like, okay, I'm ready to figure out what comes next. And so I went to business school at Stanford on the West Coast and came back to run brand at an early stage tech company in New York. And I thought that that was my dream job. And then lo and behold, I had my first son in January of 2016. And I think, in that time with him in those early months, not that they're not hard, they're sleep deprived, they're milk drenched, all those things are true. And I felt a sort of peace that I think I'd been looking for a long time. And I decided at that moment that I wanted more of that for myself. I always say that that decision was really for me. It wasn't because I thought that was the right choice for my child. I do believe that all data shows there is no one right choice. Your child can be happy and healthy with a present parent, no matter how many hours they work in or out of the home. Anyways, I did decide at that point to downshift to 2 days a week consulting, and I spent the rest of my time at home with him. And it was interesting because at that point I hadn't even fully paused, but I started to hear the rhetoric and around, was I turning my back on my ambition or worse, my feminism by
Mm.
deciding to sort of opt into a downshift. And meanwhile, I was meeting so many incredible women on the days that I was at home with my son, on the playground and in baby groups that, really didn't feel at all like this sort of shut in antiquated caricature of the stay-at-home mother. They had all had decades of career experience. They had really equitable relationships with their partners. They were considering freelancing or consulting, or they were taking a full pause and saying, you know what, I wanted to work on some personal stuff and personal development. All to say they were still growing and creating and connected. And yet at the same time, I was looking around and it was the height of the lean in movement. So there was a lot of excellent content around the traditional working mother, but it sort of had alienated anyone like myself who resonated with ambition, was choosing to take a career pause back with a very antiquated stigma. So I set about starting Mother Untitled really through my own experience. I ended up fully pausing and I was fully at home for 5 years with my children. And I was planting the seeds for this platform as the first platform empowering women on career pauses. And, I say planting seeds because there's a great irony
Mhm.
in being on a career pause while starting a platform about career pauses. So it was a slow, long journey, but one that I treasured.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like, you started something new. It wasn't even like I think some people when they think about motherhood, it's this stopping, and you even say it like a stagnation is almost associated with this pause. But for so many women, you are gaining so many new skills, you are doing so many things for your family. And for someone such as yourself, like you started a whole new business and platform, and which must have been a whole other can of worms, I imagine.
Yeah, I think that my experience also aligns. I don't think I'm alone in that. I think, there were certainly periods in a few years that I was really just sort of in the thick of transitioning to two children, for example. And that was its
Mhm.
own sort of work of healing, and mental health and, figuring out rhythms that served our family. And so there's a huge amount of skills just gained in sort of the day to day of caregiving. And then there were other years that I was able to devote a little bit more time, naps and night times, and even sort of paid babysitter times to exploring this new idea that I really believed in, that obviously, I've been able to grow since, but I really started to grow it only after my children aged into school.
Mhm.
And I want to caveat that because I think so often we see this image of someone building a huge company while being at home, and it raises the question of like, well, how did you do that? And it's to say, it'll be 8 years when my book comes out on January of 2025. And 8 years since I started Mother Untitled, 9 years in motherhood. And it was a long overnight success.
Mhm. Mhm. No, I love that. I love that reality behind it and kind of peeling back that curtain. When you decided to take your career pause, to focus on family, what were the ideas for you or norms that you heard about that were kind of affecting whether or not you made that decision or how you felt about that decision? Like, were you
Mm,
someone who heard, oh, like you're pausing your ambition, or what does this mean for you in your next steps when you come back and continue to climb the corporate
mm.
ladder? Because there's that assumption that you'll return most times. Like, what were those ideas that were being kind of considered while you were thinking about taking a pause?
Well, I think there's the ideas I had and then the ideas I was hearing, right?
Mm,
And so I
mhm.
think that's the gap I try and solve for with Mother Untitled because I think the women inherently actually left to our own devices would feel more confident and clear, but it is those outside voices. So the outside voices I heard were, that by choosing to stay at home, I was somewhat defending tradition, this idea of a
Mm,
homemaker serving their husband at that end of the day. And that was not at all how I felt. My husband was and remains a very hands-on caregiver. We really do split so many of the household and family elements, whether or not I work for pay or not. So I think that was, one part of it. I actually think a lot of the questions were, was I going to get bored? I think a lot came
mhm.
from a place of like, what are you going to do all day? And I do think that there is this sort of fantasy about women like sitting around eating bonbons when like if anyone has spent a week with a child, let alone multiple children, like there isn't really much time for that. So I think that narrative was interesting because that one actually started to chip away at me because it came from some of the people who knew me the best, who were really genuinely concerned that I would be bored, and yet I was looking at this child of mine and thinking, for the first time in so long, I feel intellectually curious again. I wanted to read the
Mm,
books and I wanted to meet new people and hear about their experiences in parenting. I wanted to understand the development of this child. I wanted to sort of figure out new rhythms that served our household. And I hadn't felt that curious in my work, in my paid work for a long time. And so, I think one of the things that's often diminished in parenting is the intellectual labor that goes into it, right? Like so often we talk about the diapers
mhm.
and the sleep and the feeding, and we don't realize that there's so much more about raising emotionally and physically well children, let alone nurturing emotionally and well homes. And so, that part I think was underestimated. And so I think the last part, which is the question you asked, was like, did people wonder if I would have difficulty returning? I actually wish people had asked that question because I think so often that women are counted out when they think that this is it. They're giving up. And I think a big part of our platform is saying a pause is not a period, right? A pause is actually time to take a breath and reset and re-examine and then like, potentially come back stronger than ever, whatever that means to you. And 90% of women do plan to return to the workforce. Now, many do not return to the same work that they were doing before because I do think motherhood refines and helps expand our sense of success, our sense of what we want if you really give it that time.
Yeah, absolutely, and so much can go into what success looks like, and I think
Mm,
maybe before you have children, it is work. It's that 9 to 5, that's your purpose, but when your purpose can expand beyond work, and it can be children, it can be family, it can be how your home operates, you can have work and all those things, and maybe it shifts the balance for sure when you return, so maybe you're not going back to 40 hours a week, maybe you're going back part-time, or maybe you've fallen in love with work related to children. Maybe you want to get involved with their schools or something
mhm,
like that. And it just looks so different. I want to go back to something you said there. And I love so much in your platform how you focus on the language around motherhood. And I want to quote you because you said, "It is a disservice to women to depict motherhood as diapers and laundry. The truly invisible and incredible work is deeply emotional and intellectual. It's the research on keeping your children healthy, the self-healing for more patience, the middle of the night worries about if you're doing it right, the extra effort to make the ordinary just a little bit more special." And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about why this language is so important for us and why we need to focus on how we talk about motherhood and almost how it's been perceived or spoken about in the past.
Well, I think that language matters, right? Language, how we talk about ourselves becomes what we project to the world, right? Um, and it shapes perception in a big way. And the perception of motherhood, there are a lot of threads to pull apart. One that I think is damaging is this idea of like martyrdom, right? Like we somehow, and selflessness. The reality is like those words mean like lacking self, Like, we do not lack self if we choose to prioritize something. And I think what it implies, even if it's intended as a compliment, right? Like, people, is that you're somehow giving up on yourself to focus on your family. And I think, so let's just take that one word. I think you can dissect the linguistics there and reveal like some real complexities around why and sort of implications from that. And in its own way, it's somewhat condescending about women and sort of what we expect of ourselves, what we're expected to give up, but also, our wholeness. And I think that, that's one phrase that I think a lot about. I think a lot about this idea of stay-at-home mother. Like, let's take the linguistics around that. Stay at implies stagnation, right? It's
Mm.
completely at odds with the idea of working mother, which is like an active verb, right? And so like you can just parse that apart. So oftentimes, a lot of the reasons why I inject new language is to create more fluidity, more nuance. I think one of the things our culture is so badly lacking and in dire need of is this investigation and exploration of the vast in between. So let's take the vast in between of stay at home and working mother. The language we use is this concept of the gray area. I think if we talk more about the gray area and existing in between, then we can sort of recognize that no matter what your equation of work and family is, that we're all working, we're all mothering. And it allows us to shift more fluidly in between without penalty on the other side, right? And so a lot of what women in the end, we ran a study last year called the American Mothers on Pause survey, and we commissioned it with Proof Insights. It was of 1,200 stay-at-home moms, 1,000 members of the general population. And the number one thing that stuck out to me was that 80% reported feeling misunderstood. And I
Mm.
think that what women are so badly looking for is the validation that the work is important and that they are still whole, growing individuals. And I think that might sound soft or it might, but the reality is, like, if we think about it from like a purely economic perspective, if we can see and recognize women for the work that they're doing, in part through language, but in part through, lifting some of the stigmas and dismantling the tropes, we empower them to get the support they need. We respect them when they're transitioning back to the workforce potentially. So while it seems sort of like colloquial language and phrases, it's about sort of injecting and infusing us a more fluid narrative so women can feel more confident and
Mhm.
feel more supported.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think a lot of women might feel, and like myself included, I'm about to take a pause, and we're very fortunate in Canada. You can take up to 18 months leave, which is great. So I'm going to take all of it, everything that I can, because I think just the time with a little one you can't get back. So why not? But I think there is this fear that, oh my gosh, I'm going to fall behind. Or if I take that long, as opposed to 3 months or 6 months or 1 year, you are prioritizing family, but you might take a hit in this other part of either your like identity or yourself or your work outside the home. And so, how might you suggest people think about that or reckon with that fear of, oh my gosh, this is going to mean I'm falling behind?
Mm. Well, I think one, at a very high level, I think to remember that a career pause is not a career ender, right? So career is such a long game. There was a great Harvard Business Review article by Dory Clark that actually reckoned that by taking pauses, maybe that's the way to make these long careers more sustainable because retirement ages have gone up, lifespans have extended. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of great work right now. Mika Brzezinski's doing it with Know Your Value to shine a light on actually some of women's careers peak in their 50s and 60s. So if that's what we're looking at, it's natural to have pauses and shifts. And if we can normalize it as part of a long game, I think that is truly immensely helpful. I also think knowing the magical phrase right now, this idea that you're making this choice for right now, but you get to recalibrate,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's important to remember that, say in America, we are not fortunate enough to have that kind of leave. So if you're making a choice to pause, it can feel like, oh my gosh, this is forever. And the reality is you can give yourself 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to keep checking back in with yourself And
Right.
the inverse is true too. If you return to work and make that choice and say, you know what, I need to come back and reevaluate what feels right for me and my family. The reality of family life is it's ever shifting, right? I think the next thing is to sort of consider that in some ways, and this is the title of the book, that this pause can actually be your ultimate power move. It can reshape what you want out of your career. It gives you a moment to reset on your goals and your expectations. It can really allow you to tune into what's true to you in this new stage of life, right? I think, especially in America, and I think in many Western countries, the question, what do you do, has come to stand in for who are you, right? So
Yeah.
if you were like, I'll take my example, I was the brand director at a tech startup. By just saying those words, it sort of implies something right away, right? I'm
Mhm.
creative. I am in tech, so I'm somewhat like with it. And, a director, I'm in a leadership role. So we have these pithy ways to really describe who we are. And when we don't have that, it can feel like we're floundering. So obviously, as a lover of language, I offer on Mother Untitled a lot of scripts to feel more empowered in the absence of a sort of formal title. But I think the bigger, deeper work is to figure out, well, what else makes you who you are? What else could you be working on or focused on right now that doesn't come with a paid job? And in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty in the workplace, actually, when you return, knowing more about what makes you whole can feel like a security blanket. Having an expansive identity that isn't just tied to your work life is really interesting. And so 67% of women report a growth in perspective and leadership skills when they return. And I think, when framed that way, I think that's the ultimate takeaway, that actually this time away from the traditional workforce, whether it's 18 months or 5 years, can be actually ripe for exploration, self-development, and really, catalyze something interesting. And then just from a pure tactical perspective, I think we're also living at a time, this is very different than 8 years ago when I started this. There's a great normalization around career pauses that is happening, in that HR managers and hiring managers are just so much more used to seeing it. And I think
Mhm.
that's where we have a lot of tools and resources, but you can find them elsewhere too, that really help you sort of own that stage of your life with confidence that you can sort of transition back more easily.
Yeah, I was just about to ask how people are feeling in terms of work. Are people who have taken large pauses, do you think it's still looked at as, oh, she's been out of the workforce for 5 years? What does that mean? Or is she ready to come back? Like, do you still think any of that exists, or are we in a much better place than we used to be?
I think both and,
Okay.
right? So I think we are in a much better place than we used to be. That is a silver lining of the pandemic, because it really normalized this idea that, women and men were taking career pauses. And there's a reality around the cost of childcare that is sort of compelling a lot of families. So it's no longer thought of as just this like rich person problem, right? It is sort of a global cross-cultural issue. So I would start by saying, yes, I think we've made a lot of progress. I think there's also a varying scale, right? Taking 3 years off up until 5 years, there's sort of a more acceptance around that. Once you start to see longer stretches, I often encourage women, like, the reality is no HR manager is going to tell the story for you. The onus is still on you on packaging those non-traditional experiences as part of your career portfolio. Because the reality is, say the average age of parent right now, someone having their child is 29 to 30. They've clocked in 8 years of a work experience before. So that's what's incredible about this generation is you've accrued work experience, right? And that doesn't
Mhm.
vanish. Those skills don't vanish. Now, what else could you add into that career portfolio from your leadership role within the home, right? Maybe you helped with a relocation, maybe you volunteered in your kids' school, maybe you facilitated community events and gatherings, maybe you took care of a child with special needs. Really thinking about, how do we package those experiences in a way that tell a story that is additive. But I do think with the longer stretches you've been out of the workforce, the more work you have to do to think about, how do we put that story together. And, the great thing is there's so many tools and resources available now to help you do that. There's also incredible corporate resources to help you on ramp that. There's masterclass and, online certification classes if you want to sort of get up to speed on certain skills depending on your industry. And so the answer is it is evolving, and I still think it is on the individual to really craft that path
Hmm.
back.
I want to talk a little bit about the feminist and feminism aspect to this as well, because I think when a lot of people think of feminism, they think of, we can do it too, and, women working and really fighting for that right to work, and almost this judgment from both sides of working women who say, "Oh my gosh, you're turning your back on feminism potentially," or women who decide to be stay-at-home mothers or home parents and say, "Oh my gosh, you're leaving your kid with a stranger all day." And how do we deal with and navigate these different judgments and opinions when, one side is saying, "Oh my gosh, like you're doing a disservice to feminism," like something like that. And the other side
Mhm.
is you're doing such a disservice to your family. Like it's both
Mm.
it's like a hotly contested subject, I think. What are your thoughts on that?
No, so many thoughts. It is like the first chapter in I really take that on head on because I do think, unfortunately, we have perpetuated so many of these stigmas amongst ourselves, right? And
Hmm.
what the freeing thing is, then we are able to also start to chip away at them and rewrite them. And I think the way to do that is to examine that, a lot of the nature of feminism, the second wave of feminism, was centered on helping expose women's capacity in the workplace and really elevate women in work. And so to make change, you do have to go far that way. And as soon as we did that, what we did was in elevating women in the work, we left behind anyone who was choosing differently with apron strings in the 1970s. And then that power chasm was created, right? And then media loves cat fights. So we sort of perpetuated that narrative of the stay at home and working mommy wars, as they were called in the 1980s. And obviously, the one thing we don't need at all is really a war between us. We need allyship. And I think the allyship is found in thinking a few things. One, I think in the data that I led this conversation with that really shows, and I believe his name's Stuart Friedman, but it's an article in Harvard Business Review called How Do Our Careers Affect Our Children? And what it shows is there is no data showing that there is one right choice in determining happy and healthy children, right? And so when we think about it that way and we make the choice really about ourselves and we say, we're choosing because this is right for our family. And maybe that's a financial choice. Maybe that is a choice based on your unique family's needs in that stage of life, right? So I think when we can own the choice for ourselves and not make it about the kids, it immediately reduces the defensiveness, right? Then I think this other side is that for a long time, we talked about one side being a luxury. We always said stay at home motherhood was a luxury. The reality that we know now is that one in three women actually have to pause because of finances, right? 62% factor in finances. And the same is true for women who return to the work and who exist in between. The privilege is to get to choose, but that applies to all sides. So I think if we stop weaponizing associating one side with luxury, we continue to find that middle ground. And then I think the last thing is something I've touched on a few times, and I talk about it, like I said, is the gray area, right? We're really looking at an incredible chapter for women right now where there are so much of us that exist in between, right?
Hmm.
Entrepreneurship has boomed among women. Freelance and consulting work has boomed among women. Part-time fractional roles. So many of us exist more in between than the sort of black and white antiquated notions. And when we embrace that in between, I think we realize that we are really ever evolving and ever shifting. And if I can just add one more data point, when we ran the survey, the American Mothers on Pause survey, one in three working women were considering a pause in the next 2 years. One in two were considering a downshift of hours. And that is to say, we're all, working mothers will become stay at home mothers will become working mothers, and more of us exist, like I said, in between.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the fact that you focus on the choice being the win. And no matter your choice, the fact that you have the ability to choose what's right for you, what's right for your family, what's right for your situation is the thing that can unite us, that we're all in this stage of feminism and the world where we have the ability to have that choice, as opposed to when we were fighting in that second wave, there was no choice to work. It was
Mhm.
kind of decided for you that you were going to stay home. That was the norm. That was the way it was. Whereas now we have options, which leads me to think a little bit about there's almost this trend on social media about like the quote unquote trad wife and traditional wifely experiences and duties. What are your thoughts on that? And how do you think it impacts the work that you're trying to do and just the notion of motherhood and home parents?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I think, I wanna ground us in knowing that trad wife is a trending hashtag, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what's ironic about the trad wife content is these are real most of those women are really smart creators who have figured out that there's an audience to be found on the trad wife hashtag, and they're running businesses alongside their life. And where but they've sort of, I think what they've tapped into from a business perspective is they've realized there's a moment in time where American families are longing for simplicity. They're longing to see their work, the parenting work look dignified. And so they've figured out a way to make that profitable. And meanwhile, what no one knows is that we have been watching this all play out. And as we all watch it, it's sort of, unfortunately, the ripple effect is that it takes us back to the mommy wars in a way, right? Because we're
Mm,
creating this whole narrative again that population, that if you are choosing to work in the home for a chapter, that you are defending tradition, that you are back home with apron strings, and that you are serving your husband a cocktail at the end of the day and baking cookies. And so I think that, obviously a side effect that I want to make sure that we all prevent is that we go back to that caricature, because that is what it is, right? It's an archetype that we're really trying to undo, so that women who are choosing to pause or downshift are recognized for the dynamic, ambitious, creative women that they are. But I also think the other part that is concerning is that content also shows a lot of women doing everything, right? They're baking homemade bread. They look stunning and beautiful. Their homes are spotless. They're doing crafts with their children. They're like, washing the dishes. When I think what we're all trying to do, especially if women are on pauses or downshifts, is to say just because you are choosing to stay at home does not mean you have to be this ideal super mom, right? We want to
right.
make sure that women don't fall into that trap, because that's damaging for our mental health. And it starts to take away from our most precious commodity, which is time. And we want women to be able to walk through this stage of life, if they choose to focus on caregiving, to be make room for that, but also reserve room for themselves to continue to grow alongside their kids. And then I would lastly say, I think that anything that perpetuates, I think my colleague and friend Eve Rodsky, who wrote Fair Play, has done such incredible work in making sure that households can re-examine how we're sharing the load in the home. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we've really made such an incredible progress in that regard, and we obviously don't want to walk that back either.
No, definitely not. I think, yeah, sharing the emotional labor and the household labor is so key and so important. And it's so ironic actually when you mention it, because some of these most successful content creators in this trad wife quote unquote space, those are business owners. Like they are monetizing, they are making
Mhm.
money, like they are in the gray area. They've just profited this ideal vision of, oh, I'm just doing my baking and my housework, but they're also creating content daily and putting that out there and finding success doing that too. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that, but I hear you in terms of that representation of almost perfection and it
Mhm.
being so unattainable. And this sounds really weird, but it almost reminds me of like it's like the motherhood version of
Photoshop and models. It's
Mm,
like this very slim, like idealistic view of what this like 1% of person could attain if they had all the resources, all the time, all the energy in the world. That just doesn't reflect reality for so many moms. And so I hear you when you say, as much as this is their choice and they're, happy to do that, and that's great, we want to be careful about what we idolize as the gold standard of being, or, what that looks like if you do choose to be a home parent.
Well, representation matters, right? And I think so much of the work of Mother Untitled was to find a new narrative for women who are choosing to pause and downshift by exposing that it's such a diverse collective of women across industries, and that there was no one way to make room for motherhood. A lot of them were also, exploring and staying intellectually curious alongside. And, that actually this new modern collective was really couldn't just be pinned to a Pinterest mom or a soccer mom or and so by having a new category as trad wife, and then it sort of represents another archetype in the media narrative, and it just happens to be reminiscent of an archetype we were well familiar with from the 1970s. And so obviously, if we're trying to move beyond that, having that in the ecosystem, having that trending, having that again potentially become something that is associated with quote unquote stay-at-home motherhood, obviously poses a risk, but I do think that they're being exposed, quote unquote. There was a Tamron Hall episode recently, and it didn't go as expected. My friend Joe Piazza was on it, and what came to light was that all of these women were basically supporting their households on their business,
Right.
which was just amazing.
So interesting. How are you seeing women? Obviously, Mother Untitled has such a large community of women, and so many women in this gray area, or taking a shift or starting different creative pursuits in this time away from paid work. How are you seeing women integrate that and what they value and what they're curious about in this phase of when they're raising children? Like what are you seeing in your community?
What I see is this. I see that 90% in the data report that having something for themselves, a hobby,
Hmm.
a project, a side business, a volunteering, nonprofit work, all helps their mood. So I think that no matter whether it's 1 hour a week, 1 hour a month, it is of great benefit. I think that what I see most commonly is that there is a period of time when women first take a pause that they just need time. Like, no one is leaving and saying right away, like, I'm ready to do my self audit and figure out what my next path is going to be. Like, parenting's intense. If
Yeah.
you're choosing to pause for family life, you're probably looking for some sort of mental health reset or room to work through family issues or, I think there's a period of time that you're re-architecting your rhythms to figure out what it looks like. And there's a huge identity transition in that. That's like huge life transition, right?
Hmm.
When your days are blocked for you in the workplace and there's calendar meetings and they're to having to set that course of, okay, this is my new rhythm. This is how I can feel healthy and my family can feel healthy. This is also greatly dependent on the age of the children, right? So like school age children versus and so, figuring out realistic, what will usually happen is at some point when children sort of age into like out of bad sleep, out of diapers, you start to see women start to explore what that looks like. And that comes in a lot of forms, which I think is what you're asking. Some of women will say, I'm ready to sort of hold a piece of my work, like my former work. I think the freelance and consulting ecosystem is really ripe for that right now. And so what's a really interesting to me that I love to see is the women who will reach out to other mom-led or women-led businesses and say, this is my skill set. And I get these emails all the time, which is so lovely. This is my skill set. I'd love to get to work with you.
Hmm.
How can I help? And I think that's where, for all that Instagram is or isn't, like, I think the fact that women are able to make those connections and feel empowered to make those connections is really pretty cool. There's also a lot of freelance marketplaces that I think, we have a flex job sport on our site. Freelancing Females has one where women are able to find that kind of sort of gig economy work. I think from there, what's interesting around entrepreneurship or starting a business, I see that with kids, parents of kids who are a little bit older. I think that at that point, they've sort of had a lived experience they've gone through. I think women naturally are problem solvers. And so they've encountered something that they want to solve for. And so that's always exciting to see. And I think that sort of speaks to this idea of motherhood as this incredible training ground, but also incredible exploratory ground. And then I see a lot of women who use it to explore, but don't really have that perfect endpoint yet, right? So women I interviewed who just make it a point to cast a wide net. They volunteer in the schools because that allows, I interviewed this incredible woman who volunteered for 5 years straight, different roles, and finally realized like, oh, I really love event planning.
Mm-hmm.
She did the school's benefit and found her way back to that as a profession on the other side. So that's a great way to iterate. Instagram, for again, for all the flack we give it, is a great way to sort of like identify your hobbies. They might pick up like this idea of interior design, right? Like they may say like, I'm looking at a lot of interior design content. Like maybe that's actually something I want to explore, right? And so you're looking at women using all of these different forums, whether they be school, whether they be online mom communities, whether they be Instagram, to cast their net and see what comes back. And I think that we're just sitting at a really interesting moment where that's much more available to women.
Yeah. I think it's so interesting too, because a lot of times you hear mothers go through this identity loss or loss of self in those early stages of motherhood. And then when you find that rhythm, you have that re-explore phase of like, okay, who am I and what am I interested in? And I have maybe a little bit of time to think about that and reevaluate that now that I'm not on this one particular track that maybe you were in your paid work life, and you've got more time to be a little bit more explorative. I love that. Amazing. I want to talk a little bit about your book. Can you share anything about your upcoming book?
Sure. So the book is called The Power Pause. It really is a first of its kind guidebook for women to enter the stage of life with more confidence and clarity. We tackle things like identity, to things like finances. And then the middle section really helps women really make the stage of life also about them, whether that be through goal setting or rhythms or permission to get help. And then at the back half of the book, which I love, is really how do you unlock that sense of possibility through networking, creative exploration, and returning to work in whatever way that feels right to you. And I think, yes, the book is a practical guide in that way, but I think what's so important to me is that it is a cultural call to action, that it's time to redefine stay-at-home motherhood. And I think if we can make it a success, I really think it will be.
I love that. All right, last couple questions here. If listeners could take one thing away from you, your message, the message of Mother Untitled, what would it be?
I think this idea of ambition and redefining ambition not as salary or career title, but really as this art of doing. Over the course of your life, you're going to be doing a lot of different things, and it's a wide platter that you're ever shifting in between.
I love that. And lastly, where can people get connected, learn more about you?
You can follow me on Mother Untitled, where you'll get reframes on the daily, and then you can subscribe to the newsletter at motheruntitled.com.
Amazing. Neha, thank you so much for your time today. This was such an insightful conversation. I feel, even just following you, I feel like I'm so much more ready for motherhood, and the way I'm thinking about it is really shifting in terms of my pause and what's going to be my next step. So thank you so much. You're so inspirational.
Well, I'm excited for you. Congratulations, and thank you for having me.